For our podcast listeners, we have got a promo code which gives you free admittance into a 2-part series on October 1st and 3rd from noon to 1 Eastern Time. It is an event that Doug Morse and I are calling a failure forum. It's an opportunity for us with our decades of experience in strategic planning and execution systems for healthcare organizations, in particular for small and rural hospitals. We are providing this 2-part series, and a promo code, GUEST, GUEST, will get you to that event for free. It is coming up on October 1st. To sign up and use that promo code, use the link in the show notes. But when there's this feeling or sense that failure is really not something that is tolerable in the organization, then the organization will either avoid setting goals or they'll set soft or easy goals. So they're making minimal or very incremental increase or improvement versus shooting for the stars. And then they may also get stuck in over planning.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzlaff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage.
Welcome to another episode of Culture Change RX. This is a Culture Byte episode, so this is a solo episode, and today's topic is failure. So I was reading an article recently that was highlighting some information from Amy Edmondson's book, The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. And it caught my attention because I was coaching recently an organization that was struggling to achieve one of its really big goals that it set out to achieve. And it was a point where they were feeling like they were failing. And so as a coach, it's not unusual to have to talk them down from these feelings and emotions and frustrations they have when the results aren't progressing as fast and their plans aren't working as well as they thought they may be. And so it is a pretty common observation that organizations that are embarking and have these big visions for big things and they set big goals, that there's going to be these moments where they're struggling, where they're feeling like they're failing and falling short. So the context of this conversation about failure is really in the context of organizations that are working towards achieving some really big things, right? So they're going for some things that are important to them and are challenging to accomplish, and they're doing it anyway. So that's the context. So I'm not really talking about, a specific medical error, those isolated events. I'm really talking about this idea of setting and achieving goals, setting big visions and plans for growth and improvement, and going after them. So I love how Amy Edmondson describes failure, or actually terms some types of failure as intelligent failures. And so she contrasts that with other types of failures, such as those caused by ignorance or carelessness, or even complex failures where there's multiple factors involved, none of which on its own would have led to the failure. And so in my risk management days in quality and healthcare, we would call that the Swiss cheese effect, where a whole series of holes line up and the mistake or failure makes its way through multiple people and processes or steps and causes the failure or harm or error. But when she's talking about this idea of intelligent failure, which I think is really a great phrase, she's referencing an undesired result in new territory. So when we set our sights on big goals, places we've never been before, that's new territory. And an intelligent failure is when we're getting an undesired result in that pathway or along that process of attempting to achieve that goal, get that desired growth or improvement, etc. Another author that his work really lines up with this topic is Dan Sullivan and his book, The Gap and the Gain. And it really can be summarized, and I hope I do it justice, it can be summarized as this. So, for instance, when we work with organizations to set goals, whether it's individual department goals, teams that are setting goals, entire organization goals aligned with strategies, when we're working with them to do that, they're really identifying a measurable goal. So from X to Y by when. And so that where they're starting, that X is really their baseline metric. So where are they starting from? Where are they right now? So let's say it's a volume increase that they want in family practice clinic visits, right? And they know what they are this year, and they know that they want them to be increased next year, right? So the baseline is where they are right now, their current volume of clinic visits. Now, their goal or their desired future state, let's say for next year, is to increase that by 2,000 visits. I'm just throwing out a number here, right? So that's the goal. So they're going from X, current number, to Y, current number plus 2,000. And so let's say that's where they want to go. And so that's new territory for them, right? And so this concept of the gap and the gain is that sometimes when we're looking at, let's say we're at the end of next year and we're looking at that end result and it's not 2,000. We haven't gone up 2,000, which was our desired future state or goal, was to increase that by 2,000. Let's say it only went up 1,000, right? And so oftentimes we'll feel like, wow, we fell short, we failed. And so this idea is that there's a gap between where we wanted to be, the goal, and where we landed, which is the end result, which was we went up 1,000, not 2,000. So we think about the gap of that 1,000 that we didn't get. But the gain is actually thinking about and appreciating that we did go up 1,000. No, we didn't achieve the 2,000, but we did improve. And so a lot of times when we're talking about failure, it really is, it's got to be put in context. So the failure of achieving the goal, certainly you could term it as that. But that's really looking at the gap of where we wanted to be to where we actually did land. But the gain is really appreciating the extra 1,000 visits that was achieved. And really, we need to talk about both. So when we're looking to evaluate, so when we get to the end of a goal period and we're looking at those measurements, we need to appreciate the success, the gain, and celebrate that and recognize that. But then we also need to understand the gap. And really, as far as using this concept of intelligent failure and undesired result in new territory and really looking at that gap, we need to make sure that we just don't say, oh, well, that's good enough. And we don't explore the gap and really explore why that gap occurred, why it may have resulted in that, and what could have been some lessons learned or some adjustments that could have been made to avoid that failure or to overcome that failure. So really we would have to make sure that we just don't get complacent and say, well, we'll appreciate the gain and then we'll just move on and that's good enough. And we don't take the time and energy to really explore the gap in understanding why it exists. And of course, you really, especially if you're setting annual goals like our partner organizations do, where they have a regular cadence of annual goal setting. And there's a pre-cycle for setting goals. There's a goal period that's a year long where they're working to achieve the goals. And there's a post-cycle where they're evaluating the goals. It's in that post-cycle that we're doing this, end goal period check and celebrating success, acknowledging the gain and the progress, but then also really uncovering the gaps and why they happened. But you don't want to wait till a year later to do that. I mean, you do want to do it at the end for sure, very formally, but all along the way, you should be evaluating progress. You should be appreciating success. You should be understanding what the gain is. You should be understanding what the gap is. And so really when you think about setting a goal or an aim, whether it's to improve a process and a result from a process, or whether it's to grow something like volumes or revenue, is that when you set that goal, then you're actually then creating an action plan that's going to help you achieve that goal. And when you're evaluating when the goal wasn't achieved, or for the areas where there was a gain or the goal was achieved, you're really evaluating the action plan, right? So it's those actions, which are really your hypothesis or your plan that says, yeah, I believe this goal is achievable. I believe we can do this in the time period we've allocated. And these are the actions we have to take to make that happen. And so it's really hypothesis driven, right? Like you're creating this hypothesis. We have this goal that we believe is possible. And we encourage all of our partners to set these goals on the higher end of difficulty. And so they should be really challenging to achieve. And a lot of them won't be achieved fully. And we want our partners to set their goals on the higher end of difficulty, mainly for this, not really to set them up to fail. That's not it at all. But really that high end of difficulty, the research supports that when we set things at the higher end of difficulty, then we have to pull together and we have to unite and we have to get innovative and creative and we have to have an all-in effort maybe by everyone, right? And so when we do that and we set goals at the higher end of difficulty, yes, there is a higher risk of failure, but there is a calculated risk for great gain, right? And so when we do this, there's probably more situations where, yes, we have gain and a lot of gain, but there may be this falling short or this sense of failure where we didn't fully achieve the goal. And so we have to get really good when we're an organization that wants to be high achieving, always improving, always growing, really out there and innovative and visionary, is that when we use this tactic of setting goals at the higher end of difficulty, there is going to be more failure. And that is that gap between where you landed at the end of the goal period and where you wanted to be when you set your sights on the goals for that year. And so I love the idea that this is really intelligent failure, that it's an undesired result in new territory. And again, that's Amy Edmondson's phrase from her book, Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. And then in Dan Sullivan's term is that we have to appreciate the gain and how much progress and result we did make, even if we fell short. And then really making sure that we learn from the gap, that we adjust our hypothesis, that we don't settle for that lower result, that good isn't good enough, and that we really do take pause and say, what else? What else can we do? And that actually, it makes me think of another book. I believe it's called The Oz Principle. And it's really about how we react when our results fall short. of our desired or intended result. And it's this concept of, are we behaving and acting above the line or below the line when that happens? And when we're behaving or thinking below the line, when we fall short or fail, it really is this idea where we might blame, we might deny, we might minimize, we might feel like victims, woe is me kind of thing, right? And so those are really below the line behaviors or thinking related to falling short. And then there's the above the line where we really take ownership in our thinking, in our behavior around falling short, where we take ownership and say, yeah, we set this goal. We believed it could work. We fell short. We tried these 5 things. And now we have to say, what do we do instead? Like, let's understand this. Let's learn. Let's figure it out. Let's analyze it. Let's dig in and figure it out. So really, when you think about this idea of setting goals at the higher end of difficulty, we get some pushback from organizations when we do this because their past culture around things not going well or goals not achieved, objectives not achieved, strategies not achieved, those kind of things, where there's really been some negative or perceived negative behaviors, thinking, or action around falling short, right? Maybe it's created a culture where there's a fear of failure. And when there's this pervasive culture, sometimes it's very subtle, but sometimes it's very obvious that maybe it exists. But when there's this feeling or sense that failure is really not something that is tolerable in the organization, then the organization will either avoid setting goals or they'll set soft or easy goals. So they're making minimal or very incremental increase or improvement versus shooting for the stars. And then they may also get stuck in over planning. I see this sometimes. I recognize this in myself sometimes, but I also recognize it in others, entire teams and organizations or departments, those kind of things when we're working with them to set goals or plans, is that they'll really get stuck in over planning because they're afraid to execute on the goal because what if it fails, right? So if you're still in the planning phase and you can justify that, geez, we haven't failed yet because we haven't even really started. We're still in the planning phase, right? So we can get stuck or paralyzed there in over planning due to this fear of failure in an organization and its culture. And then also when there's this fear of failure, there's often not a lot of conversation, or at least not constructive conversation around when we're falling short. So that gap or the things not working, we just avoid discussing it. We're not above or below the line. We're just quiet. It's not open to conversation. And so we avoid discussing, which then we avoid learning, right? Or understanding. And so maybe we don't show poor results. So maybe if you have, like in our partner organizations, let's say a department has 2 or 3 goals for this year in their department that they're working for, they'll publicly display the action plan and the trend of metrics related to that goal for everyone to see in the department. And it's discussed often at huddles and staff meetings, and it's on display all the time. But if you're an organization where your culture is such that there's this high fear of failure or negative consequence for failure, then we're not sharing those results when they don't look great, right? We're only showing winning results versus, poor trending results, those kind of things. So really, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to failure. And really the good is when it's really this intelligent failure where we're really learning. We're willing to set big goals. We're willing to take action on our action plans, which are our hypothesis for achieving the big goals. And then we evaluate how that's going. We talk about it. We study and adjust those action plans because the data will help us to know, are we winning or are we losing? And is our plan working? Is our hypothesis right? Or is it wrong? Or does it need some adjustment or tweaking? So that's really, the good of failure is when we can get into that mindset of big goals, even if we can't achieve them all, are the right thing to do. Talking about our failures and falling short in positive, constructive, learning kind of ways is the right thing to do. Being resilient, being resourceful, being creative. All of that comes from these big goals and the willing to engage in discussing the gap between where we are and where you want to be, celebrating the gain, and really avoiding those toxic dynamics that really puts us into a place where it's not psychologically safe to fail, to talk about failures, to admit failures, to own up to that. And, when we work with organizations that have this regular cadence of setting and achieving goals, or at least striving to achieve these goals, we know that they're not going to hit them all out of the ballpark. They're big goals. They are in that realm of new territory where they haven't been before. And yeah, sometimes they're going to have some undesired results along the way. They're going to have some gaps of where they wanted to be to where they ended up. But you really want to avoid those toxic dynamics of blame and shame and some of those things that are below the line behaviors, because if those things surface and they're punitive and it's negative, then you're going to shut down this whole culture of striving to be that much better, right? And we're going to get into this slow, incremental kind of, at best, improvement culture in our organization. That reminds me of another Dan Sullivan concept, which is 10x is easier than 2x. And this goes along this whole concept that when we set a big goal, it brings out actually some pretty amazing positive individual and teamwork behaviors and actions when we set up a big goal. And also it changes your action plan, right? Because if you set a really small goal or easy to accomplish goal, not as many people need to be involved and we don't have to be so creative. There's probably lots of ways we can do it and very few people need to be involved and we can make it happen. Where if it is a big goal, there's probably only a few hypotheses that will actually help us, actions that we can put on our plan that can help us achieve that big of a goal. And then we have to be brave and even fearless in the face of possible failure to go after that and to study, adjust along the way towards achieving that goal. So really, when it comes to failure, there is this good, this learning. We tried, we'll continue trying. We're going to pull together and figure it out. Then there is the bad, where maybe we repeat failure over and over again without learning or without adjusting. And so we can adjust, we can do better than that, right? We can try and fail and do better than just repeat our failures without learning and without adjustment and without lessons. And then there's really the ugly about failure, and that's when there's blame and shame, setting soft goals, paralyzed and over planning, secrecy, those kind of things. And so we want good failure, right? We want this intelligent failure that leads to perseverance and resilience, constructive learning, and really this avoidance of toxic dynamics and this creation of safe, healthy dynamics around setting big goals, charting that new territory, those big, hairy, audacious goals, and maybe even falling short from time to time. We should appreciate the gains, celebrate those, understand and learn from the gaps, and keep on going by asking, and now what? right? And how do we keep moving? So I guess I folded in some additional resource recommendations there of some books. You might want to check them out for further learning on this topic. And it might be a great discussion at an upcoming executive team meeting or a management meeting where you talk about the topic of how are we doing in our culture related to failing? Is there a fear of failure? Do we have some of these red flags of setting soft, easy goals or not setting goals at all, of getting stuck in planning versus executing, or maybe avoiding talking about failures, hiding failures, not learning from them, not sharing results when they're not winning results. So are there some red flags that say that maybe there's some fear of failure in our organization? And then start thinking about how can we create healthy conversations and dynamics and culture around setting and achieving goals. We say it often, good is not good enough, right? And so on that pathway of good to great, great to even greater, you're going to fall short sometimes, you're going to fail sometimes, and it is in those lessons that we learn. It is in that continued pursuit and not giving up that we get braver and braver to go after bigger and bigger and better goals. And I'm going to end with a quote from J.K. Rowling that says, "It is impossible to live without failing at something unless you live so cautiously that you might as well not have lived at all. In which case you fail by default." Great organizations, we know, are not created by default. And failing is just part of the journey to getting to greatness. So I don't want to really encourage you to say, go out there and fail, right? It sounds like bad coaching to say to you, go out there and fail. But there's another famous quote by Tom Edison that says, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." And so success is usually created out of this type of setting goals, creating the action plan that may need to be studied and adjusted along the way so that you can make the desired progress and achieve the desired results. So I'm wishing you very well on your journey to new territory. Oh, and gosh, before I go, I did want to mention that on October 1st and 3rd, Doug Morse and I are going to do an event where we showcase some lessons from some failures in strategic planning and execution. And so we'll provide some information and links in the show notes so you can take advantage of this upcoming learning opportunity to learn from other failures and not your own. So there's another way that failures can be a positive thing. It's not just learning from your own, but learning from others. All right. Hopefully we'll see you there in October at the Failure Forums.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.